Welcome to the 2D Web Solution Show, the podcast that provides freelancers who are wanting to make more with WordPress, the solutions to create a plan, take action, and experience success. And now, here are Arelthia Phillips and Carron with their next 2D Web Solutions episode.
Hello, guys, and thank you for being here for episode 25.
Today's topic, guys, is estimates, proposals, and contracts.
So let's get right into it, Arelthia. What is an estimate, a proposal, or a contract?
Okay, guys, so if you've been listening to us for a while, you know I like to chunk things. So let's talk about this in the different little buckets. We're going to talk about it for estimates, quotes, proposals, and contracts, each one of those kind of in a bucket. And we know we're kind of stretching it with separating them out because they're kind of similar. But if we think about this, you know, it's like when you have an estimate, it's just a written statement indicating what it's going to cost most likely and what type of work it is. What about a quote, Kerry?
Well, with a quote, it's very, very similar to an estimate. It's giving the estimated cost for a particular job or service. So it can still, it is exactly like you said, and duplicate. For me, though, the difference is I am giving an estimate during a verbal communication with a client and when they are anticipating potentially working with me. And then when I send the final documentation of what the project is, I send them a quote, which is the final price that I'm asking for that project.
And I think that brings up a great point, Kerry, because I think we're saying here there's no one right way to do it. Because like I do an estimate after I have all the information from my clients, and then I send them out an estimate that specifies what work's going to be done and what is the estimated cost based on what they've stated or what we've determined needs to be done. So how does a proposal fit into this?
Well, a proposal is your plan or suggestion. Specifically, I suppose it should be in written format, but I don't think it necessarily has to be. But it's all of the details put forward for consideration by someone else.
Okay. All right. And so we've talked about the estimate, the quote, the proposal. Okay. Now we need to talk about the contract. So if we're thinking about a contract, Kerry, we're talking about a written agreement concerning the sale of the specific service. So we're talking about lots of legalese. Now, and I'm going to jump right into our next question with this, Kerry. Why do we need to have an estimate, quote, proposal, or contract in writing?
Well, Arelthia, I don't know about you, but when I first started doing business for myself as a freelancer, I was kind of terrified about the legal documentation. And it's, you know, it gets scary because you're like, oh, I'm going to get screwed. Or you feel like, I don't want to screw up. I don't want my clients to be afraid of signing my contracts or things like that. But the reason you have to have that is because it's a protection for both you and your customer. It's going to allow you to easily be able to do work with somebody that you maybe have never done business with before. And it's going to put them at ease working with you. And maybe they haven't worked with you before. It's not supposed to stress you out. So take a deep breath, jump in, and just, you know, protect both yourself and your client and let them know that this is for their protection as much as it is for yours.
Yeah, you know, I think you bring up a great point, Kerry, because I feel like not to stress me out, you know, it's like not to stress my customer out. I think that the biggest part behind that is setting expectations.
Absolutely.
You know, the documentation, the written agreements, it lays everything out. Everything's explained in English, pure English, we hope. But, you know, there might be some legalese there, but it's so that everyone can understand the expectations for the project, not just for the developer or designer, but for that customer as well. What are the expectations for the client?
Exactly. And that leads right into our next question, which is, what is the minimum amount of information that you want to include in your legal documentation?
Okay, so I'm going to start with like the one thing that even if you ever handed a client that contract, the first thing they do is they just flip through and they look for a price. Okay, so it's important for the price to be there. It's important for your process to be laid out clearly. You know, what payment methods will you accept? When is the payment due? How will you communicate with that customer? You know, because I think that is a big point, because I want you to understand up front that, especially if you're a new customer for me, all my communication is going to come to you through email. Okay. If you're one of my tier 1 customers, then yes, we'll jump on a phone call, even do an in-person meeting. Okay. So that is clearly laid out, how I will communicate, so that there's no confusion about the expectations, the consequences. Okay, so what happens if, let's say, an email goes out and the client takes 3 months to respond? What happens? What happens if, like, what are the consequences for anything? What happens if a project's finished early? And then also, Kerry, like the requirements of the project. What is the scope of the project that has to be included? Because that helps to set those boundaries.
Absolutely. Boundaries, one of my favorite words and favorite things to put into practice. And it takes some time to do that. And you mentioned in your process, including your payment methods and your communication methods and consequences and thus. Now, for me, I place all of that information not necessarily into the contract specifically, but I do have it online, and then I refer to it within my contract. So that brings me to the next question, which is, where will this documentation fit into your process, and what needs to happen as far as keeping up with that?
You know, that brings up a good point, Kerry, because I want to make it clear that, like, that information, I don't just put it in the end. It starts with my estimate. All that information is laid out clearly, what my process is, because I think that's one of the most important things that someone needs to consider when they hire a developer. How does that developer work? Because if you can't work with me the way that I work, then we're going to have problems. And I don't want a customer to be unhappy just because they're afraid of email, or because they want to hear from me over the phone every week. No, you're not going to hear from me over the phone over every week. And so I'm not the best developer for you. So that gets laid out clearly from the estimate stage. And the way I do this, Kerry, is that I make sure that I'm not always starting from scratch. You know, as a developer, we have this term called dry. You know, don't repeat yourself. You know, I'm not going to keep recreating something over and over. I'm going to use parts that I already have. So I start with my template, the service that I use, you know, with my estimate. I already have all this stuff in there. And so I just take out the parts that don't apply to that specific customer or that specific project. And then I'm not always recreating stuff from scratch.
That is so important in what we do, because technology changes so quickly. One important thing that we also need to mention is that your information, whatever it is and however you put it together, needs to be accessible for you to use. You need to be able to find it so that you can pull and use what you need from it in the customers you have. You also need to be able to provide it to those customers. And maybe the most important is, when and if you find that something in your process isn't working, that you're able to go into your process and amend it.
Yes.
And additionally, it has to be accessible for your customers.
Yes. And I bring that is, oh my goodness, Kerry, that is a great point. Because real quick, I just want to say, you know, it's important. Like, I know my customers. I know if I have to they have to go somewhere and sign in again with another username and password. That's not what's best for my customers. It's best if I can provide them with the information where they can easily access it from their email to get what they need to approve it, or say, no, I want to change this. Okay. And so with all this being said, Kerry, we've already talked about how, you know, your documentation needs to be accessible for not just you, but for your customer, and you need to be able to replicate it. So, Kerry, what's our action plan for our audience today?
Well, our action plan for today is to create documentation that you can easily replicate and will use to protect yourself, your business, and your clients.
Okay, great. So guys, your questions and comments always help us or can help someone else. So leave your questions and comments on 2dwebsolutions.com. Thank you so much for being here today.
So now go out and create your plan, take action, and experience your success.
Kerry and Arelthia invite you to start your plan by taking this action. Submit your questions by visiting their website and subscribe to their 2D podcast at 2dwebsolutions.com.